Hey guys, it's JVL from the Bulwark here with the great Bill Bishop from Sinocism. Uh, Sinocism?
Cynicism, but that's
Sinocism?
okay. It's one of those things.
Cynicism?
You call it what you want. Just be nice.
And we were just chatting about Bill was Substack number one, first outside writer on Substack in 2017. Did you come from Axios?
No,
Had
so
you-
I had my own blog that I had turned into a newsletter, and I was sort of casting around for how to turn it into a business. I'd been talking with Ben Thompson over at Stratechery and looked at his tech stack, which was worked, but at the time was a bit kludgy, and I have no technical skills. And so I was about to launch what he had in the sort of mid spring of 2017, and then had some family issues, so I pushed it off. And you never want to launch a newsletter in August, so to speak.
yeah.
And in that interim period, I heard from Hamish, who I'd known from his reporting days, and he's like, "Hey, we're working on this thing," and I was like, "Why not? I'll give it a try." I liked Hamish, and I liked Chris best when I met him, and it seemed like they knew what they were doing, and so figured I'd just take a flyer. So we launched in September, October 2017, and it was just email. It's very
Wow.
primitive.
Wow. And so your focus is China. Where do you live now? You lived in China previously. You're not
Yeah,
in China now, though,
I live
right?
in DC now. I studied Chinese in college back in the late '80s. Lived in Beijing in the 1989, and then in the like '91 and '93, and then did graduate work. Got a master's in like basically Chinese politics, and then went and worked in Silicon Valley for about 10 years, and did a startup that became MarketWatch.com, which we ultimately sold to Dow Jones in 2000, late 2004, late 2005. Then I moved back to Beijing in 2000, end of 2004, tried to do another startup. That didn't work, but ended up living there for 10 years, doing some other things. And during that period, while I was in Beijing, I ended up launching what became this newsletter. So I've been doing cynicism in one form or another for probably, I should know by now, I think 13, 14 years.
Jeez, it's a long
Yeah.
stint, man.
Yes, it
It's a lot
is.
of words.
Yes, it is. It is a
It's
lot
a
of work.
lot of words.
It's a full-time job, but
Yeah,
happy doing it.
good. So I mean, you couldn't have picked a better subject because China is like eternally important, and it's even more. It's funny, we haven't had like direct conflict with China since like the Trump inauguration, and yet China, because of what Trump has been doing, sort of at home and abroad, China has gotten all sorts of opportunities. And I guess I want to start with just an open-ended. What does the world look like from China's perspective now that we are in the second Trump administration? Does the Chinese government look at this and say things have shifted and there are opportunities for us and we can start making moves on the street?
So I think they have a sophisticated view of how things are. I think there are certainly, and they talk about this. They see challenges. They see increasing external pressure. Most of it driven by the U.S. On trade issues, on technology issues, things like the chip controls. They also, though, see massive opportunities to continue to reshape the international system in ways that are more favorable to the PRC and its view of how the world should be ordered. And that in many ways, what they're doing is there's a long sort of strand of consistency in PRC foreign policy going back to the Mao Zedong years, when they sort of hooked up with then the developing world and Latin America, African countries, um, and other Asian countries, and now it's the global South. And so China calls itself a developing country. They say they're effectively the leader of the global South. They advocate for the global South, and so they're pushing for a more quote unquote democratic international order, right? With the UN at its core, with the WTO as the core of the trading system, but of course, revised in ways that are favorable to China. And as the U.S. appears to be pulling back from those key institutions, it creates more space for the PRC. It's not clear, though, from the PRC perspective, they may make more inroads in the global South. They have their own problems with Europe. They have their own problems with other countries in Asia, like South Korea, like Japan, like Vietnam, like India, and obviously the Philippines. And so it's a very complicated picture. I think the Trump administration, especially, uh, it adds a lot of volatility to the relationship and a lot of uncertainty, and they don't like that. Um, but at the same time, again, they create space for certain opportunities, and so it's a mixed bag. But it is a they're and this is the thing, when Trump, when we were going through the election last fall, right? There were countless op-eds about who China preferred, and the answer was, the official line was they don't prefer a candidate. And I actually think most people I talked to were like, well, on the one hand, Biden's been tough on us, but he's stable and predictable. On the other hand, Trump is transactional, and maybe there's a bigger deal to be had, but who knows, because he can also be crazy, right? And
Right.
he caused the Chinese a lot of problems in his first term, and then they got a trade deal that was kind of a BS deal, but everyone said we got a deal, and then COVID hit, and then the floor fell out. And so that's a long answer to say I think that um, they see opportunity, they see risks. The one thing I think a lot of people need to remember or pay attention to is that in the intervening years since the first Biden administration, they have put a lot of work into hardening their system, hardening their economy to be able to withstand increasing U.S. pressure, and they've also built a pretty significant toolbox to be able to strike back in ways, not just additional tariffs. If the U.S. tariffs them, they tariff back, but other ways to launch investigations, to restrict access to certain critical minerals. So they have a more sophisticated approach. Their economy also has a lot of problems, and so there are significant risks for them. But in general, I think the Trump administration, here we are, 70 something days in the Trump administration. I think it's also still unclear exactly how Trump is going to go after, like how he's going to deal with China, right? It's
Yeah.
still, they're still waiting for the sort of to figure out what does the Trump administration want and what are they really going to do. And I mean, I'm in DC. I'm not sure that people in the Trump administration necessarily know.
So yesterday you mentioned sort of sardonically, you asked if anybody understands why the Trump administration is pulling the plug on all this research and tech while China is trying to get more invested in it and exert more influence in it. Let me know. Can you talk a little bit about that? Because it was right. Then wasn't it a statement that was it the
So,
Politburo just put out on
well, so
this or no?
yesterday there's a magazine that comes out twice a month that's under the Central Committee of the Communist Party called Choshu, which is called Seeking Truth. And every issue, the lead essay is something from Xi Jinping. And this one that just came out yesterday, the lead issue is a speech he gave last June at the National Science and Technology Conference. Because China under Xi, they've long predating Xi, predating Trump, the Chinese have wanted to achieve self-sufficiency in certain core technologies. The Trump administration's actions and then the Biden administration actions really accelerated that process. And so there's a massive whole of nation effort underway to achieve science technology breakthroughs, especially in core areas like semiconductors. And so the Chinese government is spending massive amounts of money on research and development. And over the last couple of years, they've also embarked on a really significant sort of bureaucratic government restructuring to try and streamline the process for research development and actually do a much better job of taking research output and then being able to productize it, turn it into products, turn it into companies, raise money, and so this speech last summer was a reiteration of those goals, announcing some new initiatives. And the ambitions are breathtaking what the Chinese want to do. And it feels like in some ways where the US were in like the 50s and 60s. You think back to some of the speeches about like John Kennedy about the space program and sort of how it was inspiring the country. There's a lot of that going on in China. And so the question, right, is on the one hand, the US government identifies China as really its main strategic competitor. And the Chinese feel the same way about the U.S. They see, and I'll just read a quote from this article, if that's okay. I think just it gives a
Sure,
good
please.
encapsulation of how Xi Jinping and the Chinese system see this. Is so he wrote that the world is undergoing changes unseen in a century that are accelerating. With technological revolution and great power competition intertwined, making high technology fields the forefront and main battlefield of international competition. profoundly reshaping the global order and development problem. Pattern. Although China's science and technology undertakings have made significant progress, original innovation capability is still relatively weak. Some key core technologies are controlled by others, others being the US particularly, and top scientific and technological talents are insufficient. We must further enhance our sense of urgency, further increase efforts in science and technological innovation, and seize the commanding heights of technological competition and future development. And so, it is run by the Communist Party. The party is driving this process of S&T development, but people, I think, underestimate at their peril both the focus of the system on these problems, the amount of resources that are going to it, and really the ability for them to innovate even while they're still an authoritarian country.
Yeah, it's funny here, just hearing the verbiage, it really does sound like the old Soviet
Yes,
stuff.
yes, right. And it's easy though to say, oh, the Soviets failed. The Soviets actually had pretty good science. I think one of the things too is Xi Jinping. One of the animating sort of ideas in the Communist Party and Xi Jinping is basically how not to be the USSR,
Yeah,
right? To basically
yeah,
like be the Soviet Union, but actually succeed in a lot of ways.
it's very impressive. Uh, and we are, just for instance, with like biotech, it does seem like America has decided we're going to take a big step back. And
Yes.
I don't know, like if you're a researcher and you want to work in this field, like, and why would you stay in America, right?
Well,
This
and
is,
that's the real question, right? Is the researchers need money and they need support, and if the government is now cutting all this funding, right, and there are massive layoffs today, I think they hit NIH as well.
yep,
Researchers are going to go where there's money and freedom, and so China, they want to attract global talent, and that has always been our strength, right?
right.
Right. We have been the place that's attractive to the best scientific and
Yeah,
technological minds around the world. I think it's a challenge for the Chinese to attract global talent given the nature of their system. However, it it is not. I think there are still some pretty terrific international talent who will want to go to China, but more likely you'll see Canada, Europe benefiting from the cuts and the pressures here in the U.S. that are driving some of these, potentially either drive them away or having people decide they don't want to come to the U.S. right now. They're going to pick another country, and that's
yeah.
to our detriment. That is absolutely to our detriment. This is
Yeah.
one
And
of our core strengths.
what made the U.S. so attractive, for instance, was we had strong rule of law, predictable institutions, and people didn't get disappeared off the streets.
Yes. No, that I mean, this
Those
is.
things aren't true anmore. After 7 weeks, those things are all off the table.
Well, and one of the things I worry about is there's this sense that well, we're America, we're exceptional, we'll recover, and you know, I think I worry people underestimate how quickly these kind of how
Yeah.
deep and long term damaging these cuts are, but also how quickly the idea that you're a stable place with rule of law to invest and live in that can be damaged quite quickly, and then it takes a really long time to recover from
Yeah.
that.
Yeah,
If you
those things
can,
don't recover. Those things take a generation to recover because once the
yes,
seal's been broken, you have to
yes.
prove that it can. First, you have to fix it, and then you've got to prove that it can stay fixed. What about the USAID? So with USAID fed into the wood chipper, does China have any specific response to this? Has this created any like where they decide, oh, we can go into developing countries? You talked about the global South and how they want to make that sort of more multinational, more large D democratic, nah, my small D democratic, but basically not, unipolar. What does what impact does the demise of USAID have on China's approach to that world?
So they don't have a sort of a like to like replacement. But the USAID was, and again, just to be clear, you know, governments have big bureaucracies. There are reasons to regularly look at bureaucracies and certainly make some cuts and clean some things out if you need to. But you do it with a plan and a strategy, and you do it in a measured way, right? That's not what clearly is what is happening in the current administration. So the Chinese don't have they have an aid agency. They don't do what the USA does. They I don't think they will sort of take it on like for like, but they will fill the gap in some areas. But at the same time, it's also you know when you talk about the importance of soft power, right? The fact that the U.S. was showing up and was contributing in ways to um, all sorts of medicines for healthcare solutions for people in the global south. That's all gone. You know, we not only, from a moral level, are we probably contributing to the deaths of lots of people now because we're no longer supporting them with healthcare and medicines, but also it really it damages America's brand, right? It creates a vacuum that someone will fill, right? Because nature
Right.
abhors a vacuum, and that the Chinese are certainly one of those countries that is well positioned to fill. One example right now is, at least as of yesterday, this terrible earthquake in Myanmar. Usually, the U.S. would surge. They'd figure out how to get people in there. They'd surge all sorts of aid. At least as of last night, we weren't doing anything.
That's great. What a country. Very quickly. So when you and I were emailing before this, I'd said, "Hey, I want to pick your brain about the announcement yesterday about some sort of partnership between China, Japan, South Korea." Just because, like, hey, these are three countries which historically have a lot of history between them. And you were like, "I think that's over-reported." Can you tell me what the real story is on this?
So
Because
they,
I
so the three countries had a trilateral meeting, like it was the economic and trade ministers meeting between Japan, South Korea, and uh, China. Sorry, I thought I was on Do Not Disturb. I apologize. And so the headlines that came out, picked up, I think, by Reuters, were that the three countries had agreed to jointly respond to U.S. tariffs, and that appears to have been based on a report from the Chinese side. And one of the challenges is the Chinese side readouts reports, they don't always fully reflect what was discussed or agreed to on the meeting, and so that story got a life of its own. Based on the official readout from the other two, or from the actual media statement from the three, there's nothing in there that says that. And so I think they are concerned about sort of disruptions in trade, um, but this is not something like we're going to work together to respond to the U.S. That is nothing that they said publicly. And it would
that is
be,
very
I
helpful
mean,
information.
it would, I think there are reasons to expect, there are increasing trade tensions between the U.S. and South Korea, U.S. and Japan. It would be pretty shocking if suddenly those three countries said, "Hey, we're going to work with the Chinese and counter the U.S." That would be, I
Right?
think, and that's why it got such a it sort of went viral. But I think it's kind of BS.
Good. Well, that is very helpful to know. So one in a past life, I spent many years writing about demographics, and so China was always of particular interest to me, just about demographics. Um, and they put aside the one child policy. This is now 6 years ago, I want to say,
Yeah.
maybe seven. Uh, and it's getting demographic information out of China is difficult because you're never sure how accurate it is. It does not seem as though getting rid of one child has materially raised the total fertility rate there. And so this isn't a problem now, but projecting out into the future, it, is demographics on the radar of leadership in China that this is,
Absolutely.
yeah,
It's been a real switch from, we have the one child policy because we have too many people, to now they are in the process. Over the last several years, they've started to try to roll out pro-natalist policies, get people to
who is
have more
best, right?
children,
I think is the slogan.
various subsidies, various policies, and they are now, they're now intensifying those efforts because they haven't worked to date, and so they're doing trials where they're in certain cities. They're giving a bunch of money for your second kid and even more money for your third kid. Preferential housing.
Yeah.
The central government just
Spoiler,
last
none of
week.
that is going to work.
Probably not. The central government just last week announced, like, they're sending out these teams to do research around the country to figure out
Yeah.
ideas. Um, but if you look at other countries, right, who've sort of gone into this demographic decline,
Yeah.
it doesn't work. And so, but it's something they're clearly concerned with. They have a lot of big problems in their pension system. I think there's some talk. Well, they're probably the leader in humanoid robots, so maybe robots can at least replace the labor force. But based on what the top leaders are doing and the policy pronouncements, they are displaying a pretty significant concern about the demographic challenges.
Yeah. So the when people talk about demographics, there is a lot of like, oh, well, robots will take over the labor. That really, I would say that this. I'm just talking to the audience
Yeah.
here. That is at best half the problem. the problem really is like getting from here to there, because what happens is you wind up with an enormous number of old people and not enough resources to support them. And in China, you then also have a problem of sex imbalance because they have
Yes.
massive sex selective abortion, which is I forget the number, but it's something like 117 boys for every
It's
102
it's
girls or
something
something like that.
it was something like that, and I think it's narrow, but not fully.
Yeah. So you wind up with a whole bunch of men who are basically unmarriageable. And historically, uh, unmarried men, when the labor force is a little bit slack, are trouble. Like it's just throughout history, it's never good to have single men who don't have jobs. Um, so this is I do have a labor force question for you though, which is like, and that is where are they now? So in China, what does the workforce look like? Are they still at full employment? I mean, what is the current state of play, and what is, again, not talking
The
about recession or boom
no
town, but like
the
over the next 5 to 10 years, what does that
No, they're
look like
not.
for
I mean, the
them?
official unemployment rate is like 5% thereabouts, and it's remained steady. They have a significantly larger unemployment rate among youth, especially new graduates. They put a lot of emphasis on and expanded that sort of the tertiary education system, a lot more universities, a lot more spots, and then it turns out they've been graduating more people than there are jobs for white collars. They have a significant gig economy, people doing things like their version of Uber or like the food delivery services, et cetera. So unemployment is a the employment situation is not great. It's also, I mean, the economy's been struggling for several years. COVID was one of the things where the first year after the outbreak, China actually did better than most countries around the world because they were able to really tamp it down and then stay open. But then 15, 18 months in, when Omicron hit, it just destroyed the economy. And they're still struggling to come out of that. And it did a lot of damage to confidence, consumer sentiment. And then so I think employment is it's again one of the things that the leadership talks a lot about. They're doing a lot of things to try and improve the employment situation because they see, rightfully so, that large numbers of unemployed or not fully employed people are potentially social stability problems, which is true. But they they're not yet doing the kind of things in terms of economic policies to really resolve those problems. So it is a real challenge for the country.
Interesting. So talk to me about Taiwan. This is the, no, this is one of those problems that is intractable, I think,
Yes.
and has no good answers. And where also, correct me if I'm wrong, but it's really, really, what's the word I'm looking for? Path dependent. Is that the term? It's like, contingent. I would say maybe contingent is the better word, right? Like nobody knows how this story ends, and it really could go any number of different ways. Is that right, or do you think that there is a likely ending to this, or a likely path for it?
So I think the Taiwan is uh, effectively operates like an independent country, although it's not. And the mainland Beijing, they see it as a renegade province that needs to be brought back into the country. Plenty of people in Taiwan don't like to use the term reunified because they say they were never part of the People's Republic of China, right?
Right.
Taiwan is a democracy, right? It is one of the most vibrant democracies in the world. And I think that there was even a decade, maybe a decade plus, there was some way to see a path where there could be some sort of a political condominium or political settlement that allowed for um, a solution that was acceptable to both sides. That path, I think, is gone because of the way the society and the politics have developed in the PRC. What happened with Hong Kong,
I was
and,
going to say
and
Hong Kong, right?
and sort of the crackdown there.
Yeah.
It's very hard to find serious people in Taiwan who think they want to be part of that. I mean, there are some, but it's a you look at any polling, it's a very small percentage. Most prefer the status quo; they just want to be left alone. but the Chinese side, the PRC side, can't leave it alone. For example, just a few hours, like 12 hours ago, or 15 hours ago, they announced a new round of exercises to practice blockading. I think is practice blockading Taiwan. Very aggressive, showing off lots of new weapons. Put out some propaganda videos, including one depicting President lighting the Taiwan president as a parasite, and then sort of burning him alive over an exploding, burning Taiwan
Hmm.
island. Yeah, it's pretty gross. It's pretty grim, and that kind of
A little
dehumanizing of
unambiguous.
no, and that kind of dehumanizing of a democratically elected president is also one of those things that people can sort of say, oh, that's just BS propaganda, but that stuff's really disturbing. Um,
So how does the Chinese leadership think about the cost benefit analysis on this? Like when they look at Taiwan, I mean, I understand the benefits, I guess. I don't fully understand their view of the cost structure to this. What are acceptable costs that they'd be willing to pay? What do they think they would have to pay in order to do it? I mean, do they look, and how much are they influenced by, for instance, the Russian invasion of Ukraine, or America pulling back from NATO?
so those are great questions. I think it isn't known, at least publicly, what sort of an acceptable cost to them. I think though, um, the sense I get is their preference is for political solution, and if they had to use force, it's a failure, right? Because they have a massive, and for a long time, many years, massive political apparatus to try and effectively soften up Taiwan and create or create the conditions for peaceful unification. And I think on what they appear to be trying to do is, yes, they're building up their military capabilities so that if they had to, they could get to a point where they could actually achieve success in an invasion or a blockade of Taiwan, where Taiwan basically had to surrender and sue for some sort of a condominium. Um, but their military is untested. The U.S. is making it very clear that has made it clear that they're trying to get Taiwan to arm up. They're giving Taiwan more capabilities. They're working with allies like Japan to prepare for contingencies to raise the cost for the Chinese if they wanted to use force. And so that equation keeps changing for the Chinese, where I think their capabilities get better, but the cost also keeps rising as the U.S. leads um, countries like Japan and other countries to say, we're not going to allow this to happen, or we're going to inflict some sort of pain for you if you take these steps. And so I don't think that the Chinese side is confident that they could successfully execute, say, an invasion of Taiwan. And if they were to fail in an invasion, that would be catastrophic from a political perspective domestically.
Yeah.
Uh, but at the same time, if, for example, Taiwan were to announce independence, or the U.S. were to recognize Taiwan as an independent country, or other countries were, um, there's probably a point at which the Chinese, assuming Xi Jinping is still the leader, the Chinese would just go anyway, because it really is an existential issue. It's become an existential issue in the political system and in the national psyche, right? And so the best piece I ever read in DC from one of the think tanks about how to work this, as you called it, intractable problem, was by a guy at Brookings, Ryan Haas, and a guy then at CSAS, now Rand G. Blanchett, which basically the piece was like, we just have to figure out how to kick the can down the road and hope something changes in the future, maybe different leadership, so that there's some sort of a different approach to a political solution. Because this is a totally intractable problem. The only thing we can hope for is time, status quo, and over time maybe things will work themselves out. That's pretty sad. That's more wishful thinking, I think, than a strategy. To your question about sort of how they saw the Russia's invasion of Ukraine, I think there's a bunch of lessons I learned. I'll focus on a couple. One is, first, that while the Russian military was woefully underprepared, the equipment wasn't working right, and they're massively corrupt. And so the PLA, and there's been a rolling wave of pretty significant investigations, corruption and loyalty sort of related investigations in the PLA that are ongoing. Um, They also, though, I think, looked at all of the ways that the U.S. and its allies sanctioned Russia and all the things that the U.S. and the allies did to punish Russia. And they've taken that and looked at that as a playbook and mapped out how those similar things could be applied to China in the event of a Taiwan contingency, but also, of course, how then they can harden their system to be able to sort of minimize the pain or the economic damage from those types of sanctions if it were to come to that.
Yeah, that's what you talked about from the very beginning today. You talked about they are trying to harden themselves and
Yes.
become more independent and stuff. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, no, I guess I mean the U.S. policy really has always been just kick the can down the road and hope that at some point someday there's regime change in China, so
Right.
China doesn't want Taiwan anymore. Right?
Right.
That's
Well,
the
so the
American
thing
hope.
is I think that China will always want Taiwan. The question is whether or not there's a different leadership that then the two can work something out. And I think again, it's hard to be optimistic that's the case, but that seems to be the best solution anyone can come up with at this point.
Yeah.
Because, but that's again, Taiwan should be, and I think people to Taiwan should be very concerned. The president, they are clearly getting more concerned about PRC rhetoric, PRC actions, PRC's constriction of Taiwan's international space, exercises like the one that's ongoing today. The trend lines are all bad.
Yeah. What and how about the American pullback from NATO? It's my thesis is that NATO is dead, and that it was put on life support when Trump was elected, but and the hope, the best case scenario, was that Trump would just sort of neglect the NATO alliance.
Right.
The Greenland stuff seems to suggest that he views Europe not with the intention of benign neglect, but basically as prey, and that this is problematic. He's actively working against European interests, voting with Russia and Belarus, and the United Nations, those sorts of things. What influence is that having in the Pacific? I mean, do people look at it and say, "Oh, well, this is just the United States pivoting to Asia, and this means they will become more involved over here, and we should take them more seriously"? Or do they look at this and say, "Yeah, America's withdrawing from the world. The country's public does not have the stomach for overseas adventures, and
So that
we
so
can
that
expand to
so
fill the vacuum."
So the jury's out. I mean, I think that the Secretary of Defense Hegseth was just in the region. He was in the Philippines, in Japan. He also went to Guam, I think, in Hawaii. And his message was very much, no, we're not. We're focusing on this region. We're focusing on the challenge from China, and we're going to work more with the Japanese. We're going to work more with the Philippines. And he said. Then there was this memo that the Washington Post reported on yesterday. This internal guidance memo that he signed is based on a heritage report from last year, but it was very clear that. The U.S. needed to build up deterrence around Taiwan to deter the PRC from taking any military actions, and so that message from the Secretary of Defense, or those messages, were, I think, sort of run counter to the idea that, oh, the U.S. is going to leave NATO and therefore they're going to leave us too. That said, there's all these relationships. You have to have more than security, right? You have to have trade, right? You have to have all these other
Right.
ties that we're smacking them over the head about, and ultimately one of the challenges, right, with President Trump is, what does he want, and what does he want at that moment of that day, right? And so we just don't know. His staff, and a Secretary of Defense is basically like his staff can go out and say things that sound like they're the right things and say we're going to make these commitments, and yet he'll wake up one day and potentially he'll decide he wants something else. And so I will say on the NATO side, China is uh, happy probably for a couple reasons. One is during the Biden administration, there was a push to actually expand NATO into parts of the Asia Pacific. For example, and the Chinese were going nuts about the NATO is sort of the it's a Cold War relic, and bringing it to the Asia Pacific and Indo Pacific will just lead to war. And so I think that's probably off the table, right, in this Trump administration. And then again, it's a mixed bag on, okay, if NATO really does collapse and the European countries all, many of them or some of them really do arm up, I think the Chinese hope, and they've been pushing for a long time, this idea of pushing the EU and especially countries like France, Germany for strategic autonomy, right? Multipolar world to prize them apart from the U.S., right? Because the thing the Chinese fear the most is is a united front from the biggest and most powerful and richest developed countries around the world. And
Yeah.
so um, Trump breaking NATO would help on that bit, but also could cause, if it leads to some, more conflict in Europe or parts of Europe, that isn't necessarily good for China. I mean, China, I think that this goes back to earlier comments. They are, the thing I read where she talks about sort of the changes unseen in a century. And he's been saying that for several years. It's actually true, right? You see how the world is
Yeah.
changing, and so much of what they're trying to build around is this concept of sort of how to be flexible and how to protect themselves while figuring out the places where they can maximize their opportunities. And chaos is bad, chaos is good, right?
Chaos
Depends
is
on
the
how you
ladder.
look at it.
Right. Yeah. Last question. Then I'll let you go. Uh, what does Japan do with all this change happening? Like, Japan's right
So
there. You know.
I mean, that's a great question. I'm not a Japan expert. I will say I think that you've seen a pretty significant shift in the national security parts of the Japanese government and establishment towards really being significantly concerned about um, the PRC, significantly concerned about Taiwan, and really feeling like Taiwan becoming a part of the PRC is almost an existential problem for the Japanese. And so the Japanese, I think they are trying to increase their military budgets. They certainly did a lot with the Biden administration to improve sort of working with the U.S. military, but ultimately, if Japan gets the point, I mean, they're also a democracy. They certainly could. Their prime minister is not particularly popular. It's possible the next prime minister is someone who has a different view of China, and so that could shift some of those views. But ultimately, Japan, if the U.S., and if the U.S. were to really pull back and say, Japan, you're on your own, go spend 10% of your GDP on defense, otherwise we're going to cut you off, which I don't think they're saying yet. But ultimately, they're a neighbor of China, and China is a big, powerful country, getting more powerful by the day, and so they have to live in that neighborhood. And so, if we're not leaving the U.S. or not there to support them, then they have some really difficult decisions to make.
Yeah.
If I could add
Wow.
one thing on your USAID
Please.
question,
Yeah.
which actually goes back to, it ties into also the gutting of like the Voice of America, Radio Free Asia, et cetera. Also in USAID, it turned out was a huge funder of a large number of NGOs that were doing work around Chinese activities globally and in China around things like human rights issues, labor issues, disinformation. The Chinese have a long and very well funded effort to what they say improve their global discourse power, right? Which is effectively shape the conversation about China globally, not just in the Chinese language, but in any language. And so, they view themselves as in an information war globally. And the U.S. and they looked at the U.S. and they're very critical of AID and the NGOs it funded. They're very critical of Voice of America, very critical of Radio Free Asia and some of these other organizations. They passed an NGO law a few years ago because they were so concerned about some of the work NGOs were doing in China and how it was actually, potentially giving people wrong ideas about like rule of law and political systems. So the Chinese have responded in many ways, both defensively but also offensively globally in the information space. And then the Trump administration came in and unilaterally disarmed and just withdrew from
Yeah.
the field, right? And so that, from the Chinese perspective, is like, okay, for that we love you, right? That's great.
Yeah. Couldn't ask for it.
No.
Couldn't ask for more.
And the thing is for all this talk about master deal maker and maybe there's a big deal with China, we just gave it up for nothing. It's kind of weird.
It's, and also not surprising. Uh, Bill, thank you for being so generous with your time. Guys, if you're not subscribed to Sinocism,
Cynicism.
Cynic, Cynicism,
Sorry.
Cynicism to
Yeah.
Cynicism, it's really one-stop shopping for trying to get smart about this stuff, which is what I like, actually. I subscribe to, I won't even tell you. I do not
Okay.
let my list of Substack subscriptions be public because people would shame me for how much money I spend on Substacks.
Oh, I should turn mine off. I'm in the same camp. Fortunately, right? I mean, we should. There's so much great.
Yeah,
There's so many
well,
great
that's
people
the
on
thing.
Substack.
That's the thing, and it's our business.
Yeah.
But what I like to do for specialty stuff is to find like one person who is a deep enough expert that I can get all that itch scratched. And Bill is it for China, and not just in like Substack world, like out in foreign policy world, they all read Bill, and it's fantastic. Bill,
Well,
thank
thank
you for
you.
doing what you do. I really appreciate it. And everybody who's on this, hit the button to give Bill a follow and go subscribe and support what he's doing. And we'll be back. I think we got one more of these things next week.
Anytime. Happy to chat. I love these live. Actually, they're super useful and they help me procrastinate. So it's great.
That's awesome. Thanks, Bill. Guys, take
Thank
care. Good
you.
luck,
Thanks,
America.
everybody.
Hey, YouTube fam, if you want to support the Bulwark, the best way to do it is by becoming a YouTube Bulwark Plus member. The Bulwark is truly independent. We have no corporate overlords. We're not settling any dumb lawsuits with Trump. By joining, you help support our work, and you can get a bunch of perks right here on this platform. Ad-free content, bonus videos, live streams, and some emojis of me, which I guess some people want. So come join, come hang out, become a Bulwark YouTube Plus member, and I'll be seeing you in the comments. So behave.